Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Sumedha Deshmukh, a PhD candidate at University of Cambridge and a contributor at Crypto Council for Innovation, all about crypto and blockchain policy, financial access and inclusion, and how to protect users and consumers of Web3 and DeFi. But before we dive into our conversation with Sumedha, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects who helped make the season possible.
Web2 Social has become a world of walled gardens, where platforms own your data, your content, and your community. But Lens Protocol is a community garden, a user-owned, composable, and decentralized ecosystem designed to let Web3 social apps bloom. When you create content on Lens, you own it, you control it, you take it with you from app to app, and you decide how it's monetized. Instead of chasing ads and algorithms, you set the value of your work, and your community collects it directly from you. Here at Rehash, we'll be experimenting with this ourselves by posting all content from Season 3 on Lens, where our community can now truly interact and grow with us. So bring your photos and videos, your GMs, and your friends, and come join the new era of social media on Lens Protocol. Go to claim.lens.xyz to claim the last social media handle you'll ever need. And be sure to follow rehash.lens.
Contributing to a DAO can feel like this. Contributing to several DAOs can feel like this. But it doesn't have to. With Avenue, you can filter out the noise, get to know more DAOs, and start contributing right away. Avenue allows contributors to form organic teams to work together on the things they love. This means DAOs can operate, coordinate, and collaborate at a scale that used to be impossible. Because working together in a DAO should be like making music. The drummers drum, the singers sing, and when collaboration leads the way, a song emerges. No more relying on the core team to get things done. It's time to get your community contributing. To give your DAO the information they need to know, the tools they need to self-organize, and the spaces they need to work together, visit avenue.place.
Hey guys, thanks for hopping on here. I just wanted to touch base real quick.
What's up, Diane?
What's up?
So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks, Tyler, for taking these meeting notes. They look great.
I didn't take those. I'll take credit for it, though.
Wait, that wasn't you? Do we know who it was? And who's been posting those hilarious meme videos on our Twitter?
Oh, I have no idea. There's a lot going on here, though. Like, how are we supposed to keep up with what everyone's doing?
I don't know. It feels like pure chaos being in a DAO sometimes. Ellie, what was that thing you were talking about that helps DAO contributors add and organize all of their contributions?
Oh yeah, it's called Govern. It's like GitHub for DAO contributors.
Ooh, that sounds cool. How does it actually work?
Yeah, so it's actually a protocol where DAO members can add any task they've completed as a contribution. And then their fellow DAO members can attest to them to confirm that those contributions were valid without the need for a core team to do so. What you end up with is a simple bottom-up way for members to build out the DAO's contribution graph themselves. It gives contributors more power and freedom, it makes it a lot easier to accurately reward everyone. DAO members actually own all of their contributions, so if they want to jump into another DAO, they can actually prove they know their stuff.
Okay, I'm sold. Can it be on chain?
Of course, but on Gnosis chain, so transactions are super cheap.
Ooh. All right, yeah, I'm down. Diane?
Yeah, for sure. Let's set it up. What's the link, Ellie?
Just go to govern.app, and that's govern without the E, so GOVRN.app.
Perfect. All right, well, if you guys got this, I gotta jump back to another call. Hey, Sumedha, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being here. You are a friend of Anastasia's, who we had on last season of the podcast. And I'm so excited that she introduced you to us and nominated you for the podcast, and everybody voted you on. I'm super excited to hear from you. So before we dive into all the things that you are working on right now in your research and all that good stuff, can you just tell people a little bit about your background, who you are, how you initially got interested in policy, and when you started to see that connect between policy and blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and for this very cool project. I'm super excited to see how it's developed. And I think it's a really great example of community building in the space. So, yeah, I came into crypto and Web3 in kind of an unconventional way. So, I was working in international development in 2018. That was kind of what I had always wanted to do, work in developing and emerging economies. And that was around the time where blockchain was being pitched as the solution to everything, including in international development spaces. So it was, crypto is going to change the future of aid distribution. Crypto is going to change really big systemic challenges in international development, like sexual harassment. Crypto is going to change the way that we do all of these organizational structures and digital identity. And I am a skeptic by nature. So I was hearing all of these claims and not really sure what was real, what was fake, what was hype. So I was working at a media company at the time, and I just decided to do a series on a guide basically for development practitioners to blockchain technology and crypto and what was kind of real and hype at the time. And so that's kind of how I started going down the rabbit hole and understanding what the new systems were, getting an interest in the technology, and really trying to separate what was real and what could be kind of considered hype or exploitative or something that maybe isn't in line with some of the values that development practitioners or humanitarian practitioners were aiming for. So I kind of started with that series, continued to work at the media company. And then later, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, I just kept coming back to this intellectual curiosity in crypto and Web3. And I reached out to Sheila Warren, who was the head of blockchain and digital assets at the World Economic Forum and someone that we worked with when we were doing that content series. And I said, I can't stop thinking about this stuff. Do you have a job, basically? And turns out that she was hiring for her team, and I moved over to the World Economic Forum, where I worked on their blockchain and digital assets team, and I was one of the first people that was on their team there. And that was really where we started working on the policy and regulatory side of blockchain and crypto. So these were really early days, 2018, in terms of the policy discourse. So we're talking to all of these governments, and they're still trying to wrap their heads around what is blockchain, what is crypto, what is Bitcoin. And so it was really a lot of these early stage conversations on educating policymakers, but also thinking ahead to the applications and how they might be used by governments in the future. So I was very fortunate to work on a number of projects on CBDCs, on supply chain, on DeFi, on technical standards, and really get a big look at how this technology might be used and really how governments were thinking about blockchain and crypto, both from a consumer standpoint, but also from inside the government. So that's a big kind of whirlwind tour of what I've been doing on the Web3 side. And then on my PhD, as I was involved in a lot of these conversations, I think something that crypto and Web3 does and does well is raise questions about really fundamental things that we have taken for granted. And that can be the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we do regulation, etc. And so I am studying some of the kind of guts of the financial system in the form of know your customer regulation, which comes up a lot, and how they're applied in emerging economies. So it's not directly within crypto, but very related.
Wow, that is quite the background. And obviously, you've had your hand in a lot of different areas of policy as it relates to blockchain, crypto, Web3 in general. I want to dive into that a little bit deeper with you. I think anybody who's been in the space for a while, or even people observing from the outside, views this space as kind of like a risky place to be, where there are a lot of bad actors, there's some illicit activity, and it's not always safe for consumers. And I think that's a big reason why crypto and blockchain hasn't reached the mainstream yet, is people are scared to enter into this space. So from your view, cryptocurrency has been around for well over a decade. This technology, blockchain technology, isn't anything that's brand new. Why do you think that, any meaningful policy hasn't really been enacted yet to protect consumers and prevent bad actors?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think a question that's very relevant today. So I think there are a few things. First, I think for a long time, crypto kind of lived in its own world where it was really led by technologists. And as a result, the way that people communicated about crypto and Web3 was very technical. And so I think for a lot of people, it felt inaccessible or like a walled garden. And I find that very ironic because I think a lot of the messaging around crypto and Web3 is that it's open, it's for everyone. But in many ways, we had these kind of informal barriers to access in the way that we were talking about it. And I think that translates to adoption, and it translates also to the ways that policymakers and regulators were looking at crypto and looking at Web3. So I think that led to a lot of these very semantic and technical questions around where the line should be drawn for policy, where we're thinking about questions that touch consumers versus where we're talking about questions that touch the technology. And I think some of that we know the answers to today, and some of that we still, it's early days. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is one begets the other, right? So for policymakers and regulators, they have such huge agendas and they're balancing so many different things that they really only look at a lot of these issues once it reaches a point that it touches their constituencies, it touches their mandates. And so I think for a lot of authorities, they were kind of waiting to see what the adoption curve would look like, how it would touch onto their jurisdictions or touch onto their regulatory mandates. And so I think as the technology and as the space has developed, we've kind of seen how that's unfolded and now seen where there are kind of gaps in what's covered and overlaps in the policy and regulatory agencies that have jurisdiction over these different questions. So once you get into that kind of tricky territory, as we're seeing in the US and as we're seeing globally, there's a lot of this untangling of these various responsibilities and really thinking about what have we seen before? To what extent does crypto look like things that we've seen in the past and things that have already been regulated? And what is really new and requires new structures or new frameworks? And I think for policymakers and regulators, that's a very delicate dance because they're obviously creating these frameworks for the long term. So it's about protecting consumers and really getting to the heart of what's touching the retail investor, touching the retail customer, for example, while also making sure that they leave space for innovation and trying to think through where can this technology go in the future.
Yeah, totally. I think that is the ultimate question is how do we have enough regulation where consumers and users are protected, but innovation isn't stifled? So I'm curious to hear your take. Like, in your view, what sorts of policies and regulations are needed and at what level? Like, where do you see that balance being stricken between enacting policies that protect consumers while at the same time not stifling innovation?
Yeah, I think this is the question of the hour. So I wish I had like the best answer in the world because I think this is the question that all policymakers and regulators are looking at the moment. I would say the easiest place to start is volume. So we know where a lot of customers are coming into the system, especially those that are not as sophisticated, right? So we know the on-ramps and the off-ramps, the exchanges. That's really where a lot of people are interacting with crypto. And that's also where we see a lot of activity that looks like things that we've seen before. So for example, we're kind of recording this under the news cycle of FTX. There's a lot of activity that FTX conducted that we've seen in financial service providers before. And so I think there are kind of some of these places that we can see activities have been regulated in the past and can be similarly assessed and regulated in the future, particularly when it comes to the centralized forms of interacting with crypto and Web3. I think the decentralized spaces is where we see a lot more promise for innovation. And I think that's also where policymakers and regulators are actually taking a more careful approach and a reserved approach. So, for example, in Europe, they passed a big crypto package called MiCA, and they deferred making decisions around DeFi and some decisions around NFTs, because here's where we see there might be some fundamentally new innovation. Similarly, in the US, we've seen kind of a focus on stablecoins, centralized exchanges, et cetera, and kind of leaving some of the other questions for later down the road as we see how this technology continues to develop and we try to think of new models that might be a better fit for some of the new models that we're seeing out of Web3. So I think it's a matter of phasing to really think about what is the highest return on investment of a particular policy or regulatory decision and its impact on the average consumer. So I think that's really where we're seeing the focus today. And then the other thing that I'll just say, I don't think that this is the right approach, but I think this is the reality. But a lot of these processes are highly political. So it does fall in line with the news cycle. And so I think what we're going to see, and again, I don't necessarily endorse this approach, but this is what I think we will see and continue to see is cycles of policy and regulation that follow the big news story. So when we had the announcement from Facebook about Libra and then Diem, there was a lot of focus on stablecoins and the so-called global stablecoin. Now that we see the recent news stories that we've seen with FTX, I think there's going to be a lot more focus on centralized exchanges and the way that they interact with consumers. So I think there is very much a political element and political dynamic to this that we can't be naive about. And I think that's part of why this educational component is so important, because we've seen what reactive policies can do in the past. And I think if we actually want Web3 to be different, we have to be a little ahead of the curve and getting ahead of some of the news stories that are bound to come and have already come.
Yeah, I think one of the most fascinating things to see come out of policy is going to be with regards to the more decentralized elements of crypto and blockchain. So, with regards to the centralized exchanges, I think it's going to policy has to start with more of the centralized components like centralized exchanges and things like that. That's sort of step one to figure out. But beyond that, the whole promise of crypto and blockchain is this element of decentralization. And especially with everything that happened with FTX, now everybody is talking about, this is why it's important to self-custody. This is why it's important to move away from, the centralized exchanges, to not trust centralized entities and intermediaries, but to, just have everything be fully decentralized. I think what's happened in the news recently has sort of, encouraged decentralization maxis to be even more bullish about their thesis. So I'm curious, from your perspective, if you had to make the best prediction that you could, where would you say that we should expect policymakers to land with regards to some of the more decentralized aspects? So, for example, how do we reckon KYC practices with, operating on a decentralized exchange?
So I think those are separate but related questions. So I think overall, the policy approach is going to be really trying to learn about this space and creating frameworks that are in line with earnest attempts at decentralization. So a lot of these regulators and policy teams are getting really smart on DeFi. They're really trying to understand, what does it mean for a project to have progressive decentralization, to govern itself, to have these tokenomics. So I think it is a matter of getting up to speed and then coming up with frameworks that are fit for purpose, ideally, and understanding, where they can and can't intervene in terms of technical capabilities. So we're getting a lot of very thoughtful questions, I would say, from policy and regulatory teams on the technical aspects of it. But again, it's such a small part of their portfolio that it's going to kind of take a long time, I think, for them to fully be able to dedicate the resources that are needed to understand such a complicated technical space. I mean, like I said, I've been working in this stuff for a long time and I still have all of these questions and feel like I don't know what's going on. So I can imagine if you're balancing 100 different things, this can be a really hard thing to wrap your head around. So I think in terms of the overall policy frameworks and the regulatory frameworks, I think they're coming in time, but I do think it's important, and these actors recognize the importance of getting up to speed before making anything. On things like KYC, I think that's a very specific framework, and there's a lot of political impetus to adopt these things. So I mentioned MiCA, which was adopted in Europe. They adopted it with the transfer of funds regulation, which is their implementation of KYC. And I think we're seeing around the world countries kind of adopting frameworks around KYC and seeing this as a really important part of the financial system because it's one that's been around for so long. And I think the political momentum is towards adopting it as is and really trying to fit the technology and fit the ways that people are transacting with each other into this framework that has existed for a long time. I think it's part of the role of industry and advocates to really educate on the limits of what's possible there and the frictions that a system like this could cause, and really kind of make the arguments for what we're trying to do here. So when we transact with each other in cash, we don't KYC each other, right? So I don't KYC you if I'm going to hand you a $10 bill. And there are, as a result, pockets of illicit activity that happen through cash and through things that are not KYC'd. And so I understand the kind of impetus that these regulators and policymakers feel around, the things that haven't worked in the past around preventing illicit activity. But I think something that we keep coming back to is this idea of optionality. And there will be people that want to transact in high volumes and have a lot of liquidity and interact in a custodied way, have insurance on their products because that's what they know. And there will be a certain set of regulations that should and will apply to that. But I think there also should be, options for people that don't want to interact with the system in the same way. And we think about alternatives to preventing the harm that we're trying to prevent, right? So a lot of the biggest enforcement actions in the past decade in the US have actually been crypto-based because we were able to use blockchain analytics to track illicit activity and seize those assets. So I think it's not a matter of are we trying to facilitate illicit activity using crypto, which obviously has happened in the past. It's about how do we reframe the harm that we're trying to prevent and use these new tools and technologies in a way that's better suited to the space and to the technology. So I think, the political momentum is going one way, but I think hopefully with education and conversations, we can shift the conversation a little bit to say, we're not trying to skirt the system for the most part. It's just we have to reorient given what the new technology has to offer and how it operates.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think education is hugely important on both the consumer front and on policymaker front. We have to educate policymakers on these things because, like you said, they have huge agendas and this is only one segment of the things that they have to study and work on. But then on the other hand, we have to educate consumers as well in order to protect them before the regulations and policies are enacted. I guess last thing on this topic, I love what you just said about, how can we craft the narrative, reframe the narrative for policymakers to help them understand what it is we're trying to do here. We're not just trying to have a new form of currency to conduct illicit activities with, but there's so much more to this. I'm curious to hear the narrative that you would propose for people who are already in crypto, people who are currently transacting using crypto or working in blockchain technology, who are maybe skeptical of regulation and of policy. I think that is a common discourse that we hear in the space is, the people who are very anti-regulation and don't want to see any regulation. Just let us live free and do what we want. Don't tell us what to do. I think that's, a common discourse we hear. How would you recommend reframing the narrative to people like that to help them understand why regulation can be helpful to them as well, and why they should maybe be a little bit more open to it or more welcoming to it and join in the cause to help us help policymakers to enact the most beneficial policies for everybody?
Yeah, a few things. I think on the industry side, it brings legitimacy. So if we do want adoption and we do want scale, we need legitimacy. And I think a part of that is regulation, acknowledgement from policymakers and regulators, and a framework in place to protect customers from bad actors. A lot of people who have this mentality, I think they have mechanisms and means for operating outside of the system. They know how to protect themselves. They know how to self-custody. They have their cold wallets. And, I think a lot of people who want to go under the radar and operate under the radar, they are doing so just fine. The people that we want to bring into the system are people that may not have the same type of sophisticated knowledge. They may not have the technical knowledge. They may not have the knowledge of financial products. And in those cases, they are ripe to be taken advantage of. And we've seen that in this space. Let's be honest about what we've seen in the space. We've seen a lot of bad activity. And I think for an industry that, touts financial inclusion and touts bringing people in and the historically excluded populations, we should want some protections in place that are in line with expectations for customers. And again, I think it's about that spectrum of choice. If you want to interact in a self-custodied way, you should have that option, and we should use the tools in place to prevent bad activity there. But for people that are average retail consumers, maybe they want another option, but they want protections that they're familiar with from other financial products. We've seen what can go wrong at scale and in a really detrimental way for people that are taken advantage within the financial system. And I just find this argument a bit ironic because that's what Bitcoin came out of in the first place, right? Is people acting against the interests of the average consumer, Wall Street, and what went wrong in 2008. And we're seeing a lot of that same activity play out in crypto because of the lack of regulation and the lack of oversight. And so I think that's important for people who are coming into the space newly, are promised these really high returns, are promised certain types of products that may not have the backing that people claim that they have. And I think that's part of the healthy functioning of a financial system is having consumers know what they're getting into, and then they can make the choices that they want to make, but not being fed false information. I think that's part of what policy and regulation is for.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that you just mentioned and that you talked about in the beginning too, with your background and how you got drawn to crypto and blockchain in the first place, is this concept of financial inclusion and access, right? So the idea that crypto can help level the playing field, the financial playing field for everybody, regardless of their background. That's something that was one of the first things I learned about DeFi as well. And that really drew me in as, this is really interesting. If there is something, a tool that can help correct the wrongs that we've seen in history and help put everybody on an even playing field, that's something that's super exciting to me. But in practice, in real life, at least in the US or, in Western countries, it seems like that promise hasn't really been fulfilled, or at least I haven't seen it fulfilled in any meaningful way. Have you seen this play out in real life, or how do you think we'll actually see this promise, this really exciting promise, play out in practice?
Yeah, I think this is a great question and one that I'm really passionate about. So I think you're right. We haven't seen good use cases for this at scale right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way we're building and who is building, because I don't think we're asking the right questions to get these end results of actual inclusion and access to a system that, as I mentioned before, has felt very inaccessible to people. And in some ways by design, because people are benefiting from closed airdrops or not that they're closed, but, selective participation or information sharing about some of this stuff. And I think people like to feel like they're in the know about things. And so I actually don't think that we've done a good job of constructing an accessible and inclusive environment for people to join crypto. And I think until we do that, we're not going to be asking the right questions to build products for people that actually work. So I've seen a few projects that I think are really trying to be community-based, but for the most part, I think the construction around inclusion has been more kind of lip service than actually designing systems that work for people and that are meant to really draw out some of the challenges that people are facing and meaningfully solve for them. So I think where we see a lot of activity is where people use crypto out of necessity. So in vulnerable communities where there's, for example, hyperinflation or human rights violations, I think that's where we see a lot of really promising activity, because it is a way to hedge against some of the risks in these volatile settings, whether it's currency volatility or political instability. It offers a very legitimate alternative to a system that isn't working for people. And I think that's where we see a lot of activity that has somewhat been reported on, but I think there is still a lot of storytelling to do around the promise that crypto and Web3 holds in those settings. And importantly, how we can make products and education to make that even more effective. Because again, I don't think that we're necessarily building with this end goal in mind. It's really just a byproduct of circumstance and people really needing something in a pinch and doing everything that they can to use services that have not been designed in a very user-friendly way. I think we need more inclusive systems and ecosystems to be asking those right questions. So I always use this example of a lot of organization happens on Discord in the crypto space. There's a very specific type of person that can sit on Discord all day and monitor all of the notifications that come in and contribute to projects with income that's given in crypto or that's not stable. You're really designing a system that favors a certain type of person and leaves out a lot of the questions that we could be asking about the way that we're designing these products, what we're designing, what we're creating. So I think that the attempts at inclusion and access need to be a lot more thoughtful and a lot more deliberate. And I think that comes with bringing in people who have experience in this stuff. So I think we're just reaching an inflection point in crypto where we're bringing in more people from non-traditional, like non-tech backgrounds to really look at these things from an ethnographic perspective or a UX design perspective. And I think that's the kind of stuff that's really going to move the needle on crypto realizing its promise, is really starting way at the beginning and thinking about what are the problems that we're trying to solve for, who are the people that we're trying to serve, and who are we not serving today, and working from there to a system that hopefully works for more people.
Yeah, it's kind of a cyclical thing, right? It's sort of like, because this space right now is so homogenous still, like the people we see working in Web3 still very much look like the same people we saw working in Silicon Valley, which is what built, the Web2, the previous versions of the internet. So not much has changed there. And we're saying that in order to help crypto to realize its full potential, that we need to be building not just for this homogenous group of people, but for a much more diverse group of people. And in order to understand what that diverse group of people needs, we have to bring in people from that community to understand that. So it is this cyclical thing where I do think it starts, though, with the people that are working in the space has to be a lot more diverse than the group that we're seeing today. And so I think that's probably where we have to start. And that also will help, encourage more diverse people to come into this space too, because at the same time that we're not serving a diverse group of people with what we're building, we're also not encouraging more diverse groups of people to come into the space and help us build, because they don't feel like they belong and they don't feel like they're welcome here, right?
Definitely. And to me, there are real consequences to that, right? So at best, we miss the opportunity to expand possibilities within the financial system, serve people that have been unserved or underserved or historically excluded. And at worst, we create really big problems for people. There have been a couple of times that projects have come my way or asked for feedback, because obviously I look a lot at inclusion and identity questions, and I have a background in development and humanitarian assistance. And I have been shocked by the things that they have not thought about when it comes to personally identifiable information, or when it comes to sensitive information, or the public nature of blockchain transactions. There are a lot of things that can go wrong with this technology. And so I think it's, not only are you not doing the good that you could be doing, there are a lot of places where you could be doing harm. So I think we do need to be bringing in people that have those perspectives. I wouldn't even call myself an expert. It's just a lot of this stuff I've studied or read about. So I have a gut reaction to some of these things. But I'm still from the US. I grew up going to India, but I've never lived in India, or I've never lived in any of these settings for a long period of time. So there are things that I wouldn't think about that someone whose lived experience it is, they can tell you in a heartbeat or react in an instant to what will serve them and what could cause potential harm. So I think we need to be very thoughtful and deliberate about that inclusion and taking those steps from the very early days.
Yeah. So last thing, Sumedha, paint the perfect picture of our future for us. If all goes well, if we take the steps to make the space more inclusive, if crypto realizes its full potential, what does life look like? I know that's such a broad question, so feel free to hone in on maybe one specific thing, or maybe, since you're from the US, like a lot of our listeners are, maybe we can just paint a picture of what it looks like in the US, because I think that's one place where the full potential of crypto really has not been realized in even the least bit.
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think this is part of what we like to do too with policymakers and regulators, is have this kind of imagination for a different type of future. Maybe instead of boiling the ocean, because I think we don't know what we don't know about what the future will hold, I'll say I'm super excited about the future of digital identity. I think this is a place that is going to unlock so much and give us hopefully more ownership over our assets, our data, the way that we move within spaces. And I think that's a really exciting possibility for the future. So I think the conversations around permissioning, the conversations around credentialing and verification, I think that's a really exciting foundation from which we can progress to a really exciting Web3 enabled future. And then the other thing I think is, really trying to deliberately build this financial system from the ground up to think through why people have been historically excluded or underserved by the systems that we have today. So if you look at the statistics, about 1 in 5 people in the US are or underserved by the current financial system. That is a lot of people. And I think this is really a once in a generation opportunity to ask, why is that? Why has the system been built the way that it has been built? And how do we start to unpack and undo some of the structural and power dynamics that have led to these systemic inequalities. So we know for a fact that it is expensive to be poor. These are the people that are kind of disadvantaged at every stage. So I think this is the chance for us to unpack some of that and hopefully create a system that I don't think was going to be problem free, because I don't think you can ever design a system that is problem free. And maybe that's cynical of me, but at least really deliberately thinks through these tough questions at the outset and mitigates some of the harmful or exclusionary practices that we've seen today.
Well, I am just as hopeful as you are that that is the future that we'll be looking at. And like you said, we have a very unique opportunity in front of us, once in a generation opportunity to enact that change. And so hopefully we can all get on board with, doing our part in helping create the future that we all want to live in. So I like to finish every podcast episode with a few fun little questions. Some are related to crypto, some are not. It's just for people to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one I have for you is, you can rebrand one thing in Web3 and it's guaranteed to stick. What do you want to rebrand?
Oh, there are actually a lot of things that I would rebrand in Web3.
You can share more than one if you've got a bunch.
I would say from a policy standpoint, because obviously that's top of mind, more nuance in stable coins. That is like a big debate and question that we have all of the time with policymakers and regulators of what is a stable coin, what's not a stable coin. I think that's one of them. I think just the way that we categorize and label tokens in general, I think could use a refresh. I think a lot of this stuff is just kind of developed opportunistically. And now when we're applying policy and regulation to them, we're just constantly bumping into these really sticky definitional questions. So I would say like token categorization as a thing. We would just start over, really think through what is a token providing, what value is it providing, and come up with definitions that actually align with their function.
I'm super on board with that. I don't think anyone really knew what the word fungible meant until crypto happened, right? I don't think I've ever used the word fungible in a sentence ever before using it in the context of crypto.
And I think there are so many people that still wouldn't be able to tell you, but they will be the biggest proponents of an NFT.
For sure. Okay, second question. If you could wave a magic wand and any Web3 app, tool, or protocol would immediately exist, what would you want that to be?
Yeah, I think I go back to digital ID, like a self-hosted ID product that's really clean, user-friendly. I study ID all the time, and it is just such a messy and understudied area. And I think if we could create a product that is just user-friendly and connects into all of these different apps and can be used for different purposes, I think that would go a huge, huge way. Yeah, I mean, for like, this is a simple question that I pose to people, but it's something that I'm interested in. Like, why do we use our driver's license to access a bank account? It is just such something that we take for granted. So I think those two systems are entirely disconnected, and yet somehow we connect them and we make it work. But if we're able to rethink identity in a way that actually is creating products that are fit for purpose, that is a really, really exciting possibility.
Yeah. Or the question I always ask is why does the bouncer need to know my data, like all my personal identifying information for me to go have a drink at their bar?
Yeah. Like, I mean, we don't question it, but it's so creepy that they have your address, right? When you're
know.
Like, I'm just trying to tell you that I'm 21.
I know. Exactly. I actually think about that all the time. Next question. If you were a famous person or character from history or pop culture, who would you be?
Oh, I have a famously bad knowledge of pop culture.
It can be a historical figure. It can be.
Well, I think I would say Mindy Kaling. I love Mindy Kaling. I think she's amazing and hilarious and has done amazing things for brown women. So I would ideally be friends with her, but failing friendship, I would just be her.
Nice. I love it. Okay. If money were no issue, like if you knew that you were financially set for the rest of your life, what would you be doing with your life?
I think I would be a teacher. I love teaching.
Really? Okay.
I've always loved teaching. I've always loved kids. So I think I would be a teacher.
I love that. And last question, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you want to live?
Honestly, I love the US. I've been in the UK for a couple of years now, so I like here. It's been a fun time to travel back, but I think I would actually just move back to the US, which is kind of a boring answer, but my family's there, my friends are there, so I'd move back somewhere to the US.
That makes sense. Where in the US?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I loved living in San Francisco. I was there before I moved to the UK, so maybe there. Obviously, a lot of policy activity in DC. Love it there as well. So really open to different places in the US. But for now, I think I would move back.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, it's what you know best. It's what you're most comfortable with, and there's so many options within the US too. You know that like you wouldn't get bored if you just like hopped around the US.
Yeah. Well, and my big pet, I guess if I wasn't a teacher, I'd be a national park ranger. I love the national parks in the US, and my goal is to go to all of them. So part of this is also that I have to move back so I can check off the rest of the national parks on my bucket list.
Okay, well, if you need a travel buddy for the national parks mission, I am always down. So hit me up anytime for that.
Yes, they're amazing, and I don't think they get enough credit. They're
totally agree.
So cool and so great. So maybe I'd live secretly in a national park somewhere in the US. Haven't decided which one yet. I have to go to all of them, and then I can decide which one I would live in.
Okay, cool. We'll compare notes and figure out the best national park to hide out in.
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. Well, before you go, Sumedha, tell people where they can find you if they want to just keep up with what you're working on or get in contact with you. And feel free to plug away at anything you'd like.
Yeah, I am Twitter shy, so I do not really post on Twitter, but you can find me on Twitter at sumdesh, SUMDESH. And if you DM me, I will respond because I'm a Twitter lurker. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. And I'm always happy to talk about this stuff, answer questions. And yeah, I'm a big crypto policy regulatory nerd, so always happy to talk about this stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sumedha, for taking the time for sharing all your wisdom with us about policy and regulation, which is a super important topic, one that none of us can avoid or escape from. So hopefully everybody learned something new today. Thank you again so much. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And we'll be back again next Thursday with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. Sumedha Deshmukh was nominated by Anastasia Uglova and voted onto the podcast by Anastasia, Catherine Wu, Ellie Dots, Tyler Internet, and Diana Chen. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, sponsored by Lens, Avenue, and Govern, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3, on Lens at rehash.lens, and join our Discord to get involved.